Hi everybody, and welcome to WTF Hammer Underworlds. Today we're going to be doing another warband review for Season 1, specifically looking at Spiteclaw's Swarm. So the lore is written here, but just to summarize, so the backstory of these guys is a little bit unspecific. Basically being Skaven, they're just constantly on the hunt for new gadgets and new trinkets, and they wound up in Shadespire basically doing that, hoping to eventually find a route to freedom. In this warband review, we're going to be looking at all of this warband's cards, starting with the fighter cards, then eventually their faction-specific cards, being their objective and power cards. And then finally, we're going to be rating this warband on a scale of S to D, S being great, D being garbage. With that in mind, let's just jump right in and get into the fighter cards. This warband has 5 units: Scritch Spiteclaw, Kirk the Almost Trusted, then 3 Skaven minions, which I guess don't represent specific units, but just units that can be called upon through Scritch Spiteclaw's special ability, which we're going to be looking at right now. So starting with Scritch Spiteclaw, this unit's actually really cool. He has a decent attack, 2 range attack, 2 hammers, 2 damage, becoming 3 damage when inspired. Starts off with pretty terrible defense with 1 dodge, going up to 2 dodge once inspired. Has great movement, 5 movement, good wounds, 4 wounds, being a leader. Interesting inspire mechanic where if you select Scritch as a fighter when using a ploy card that specifically has the choose word written in it, then he inspires. And this is the same inspire mechanic that affects all other units. And it's an interesting inspire mechanic because it can be very easy to pull off, but it also forces you to sort of cater your power cards, your ploys, towards cards that have that choose keyword. So getting back to Scritch Spiteclaw's actual abilities, he has a Wicked Halberd, meaning that if he rolls a crit, his attack has cleave, and more importantly, he has a special action where he gets to basically summon dead minions, where as an action he can place a friendly fighter that was taken out of action, other than Kirk, so basically those other Skavens, the Festering, Lurking, and Hungering Skaven, and place them on a starting hex in anyone's territory. Next we have Kirk the Almost Trusted. Similarly has great movement with 5 wounds, starts with 1 shield or 1 block defense I guess, going to 2 block defense, only 3 wounds which is decent but not exceptional, and his attack is okay. It's 1 range, 2 hammers, 2 damage, and doesn't get any better when he inspires. We have Lurking Skaven who just gets an increase to his attack accuracy, going from 2 swords to 3 swords. Hungering Skaven also getting that increase to attack accuracy, going from 1 hammer to 2 hammers, but Hungering Skaven also gets that bonus to dodge, going from 1 dodge to 2 dodge, whereas Lurking Skaven already starts with an innate 2 dodge, which is very nice. And finally we have the Festering Skaven, going from 2 swords to 3 swords and 1 dodge to 2 dodge upon becoming inspired. And you'll notice that with all of these minion Skaven, they each only do 1 damage, which is not very exceptional, and they each only have 2 wounds, which is actually pretty terrible. It's as low as wounds get in this game. So after having covered those cards, let's just check out the pros and cons. Pros being that they have a special combat ability, that being Cleave, but only when Scritch rolls a crit. Scritch also has that special summon ability that I described, where you can bring back Lurking, Festering, or Hungering Skaven on any starting hex. They are easy to inspire in theory, so if you cater a deck to have many ploys that have that choose keyword, then it is incredibly easy to inspire your units. They also have good defense when inspired, although Lurking Skaven always has good defense. They have great movement, they have decent accuracy, they have a range 2 attacker in Scritch, and they have a medium model number, that being 5 models, which is a good amount of models to rarely have any wasted activations. Fighters also have a bit of cons. First con being a little bit obvious, that their deck must be catered towards their inspire mechanic. Problem being that there are actually a lot of really nice ploys that are out there that don't have the keyword choose in it. And it can become a bit of a difficult choice sometimes when you're trying to determine what ploys to put in your deck, knowing that if you don't put ploys that have that choose keyword, you're never going to be able to inspire your fighters. They also have many low wound models. They have 3 units that only have 2 wounds, which makes them very easy to get taken out of action. Although they can be summoned back, it still gives your opponent glory points each time your units get taken out. And finally, their success stems on Spiteclaw's survival, seeing as he's the only unit that has that inherent summon ability. If he gets taken out, no one else is getting summoned back to life. So those are the fighter cards. Now we're going to be looking at the objective cards. Starting with the Surge, we have Arm's Length. Score this immediately if your warband takes an enemy fighter out of action while they are adjacent to none of your fighters, worth 1 glory point. I'm giving this a B because it's decent. If you have ploys in your deck, like Pit Trap or something like that, or any ploy that just sort of causes damage to enemy fighters, then this can be decently easy to score if you get a unit down to low enough wounds. One of the challenges, though, is that these guys' ploys needs to cater to their Inspire mechanic, meaning that if you make a deck with these guys, you wouldn't want to invest too many ploys into causing damage to other fighters. Your other way of pulling this off is by having Scritch take someone out with a range 2 attack, but that involves putting Scritch into a dangerous position, which you may not want to put him in. Therefore, I can only justify giving this card a B. We have Scritch is the greatest, yes, yes. Scores immediately if your leader takes an enemy fighter out of action, worth 1 glory. So for the same reasons as the previous card, I'm giving this a B because although Scritch is very good at taking units out of action, it puts him at risk, puts him in dangerous positions unless the enemy is encroaching on you. So it becomes a little bit difficult to score this card unless you plan to be offensive with Scritch, which isn't necessarily a winning strategy. So that covers the Surge cards. Now we're going to be looking at the Score and the End Phase cards. We have Brilliant, Brilliant. Score this in an end phase if you scored 2 or more other objective cards in the preceding action phase, worth only 1 glory point. So I rated this as a C, but as I'm rereading it, I'm thinking it's worth more of a D because it's basically a combination strike, but only worth 1 glory point, making it kind of useless to put in your deck considering that combination strike is still floating around, so I just would never include it in any of my decks. Next is Feast, Feast. Score this in an end phase if all enemy fighters have been taken out of action, worth 3 glory points. I'm rating this as a D for sure because it's basically Annihilation, but only worth 3 glory points instead of 5, and Annihilation exists in every meta and keeps getting reprinted, so I don't see any reason why anybody would put this card in their deck. We have Hone Survival Instinct. Score this in an end phase if no friendly fighter was taken out of action in the preceding action phase, worth 1 glory point. I'm giving this a D as well, because with so many low wound units, it's very unlikely that none of them get taken out of action. So I wouldn't recommend building any kind of a objective card strategy that centers around keeping your guys from taking hits, because they're going to go down. Next we have Kirk Now Leads. Score this in an end phase if your leader is out of action and a friendly fighter named Kirk is on the battlefield, worth 1 glory point. I'm giving this a C just because if it does happen that Spiteclaw gets taken out of action, then this becomes a card that can be scored pretty much automatically, but it's definitely in your best interest to try to have Kirk attack and die first in hopes of protecting Scritch, because you don't want Scritch going down at all, so implementing any kind of strategy that centers around Kirk staying alive and Scritch dying is just a bad strategy in my opinion. We have Lives Are Cheap, and I've written the new errata description that was provided by Games Workshop on this card, and it reads, score this in an end phase if 1 or more friendly fighters were taken out of action in the preceding action phase, and a friendly fighter had already been taken out of action in that phase. So in other words, score this in an end phase if 2 of your units die in a round. I'm giving this a B because it's pretty likely that 2 of your units could die in a round, but it's only worth 1 glory point. And in scoring this, you're basically losing 2 glory points because the enemy that takes you out of action is scoring glory for taking your units out of action, not to mention whatever objective cards he scores as a result of doing it. This card isn't terrible, but it's definitely not above mid-tier. And that finishes the end phase cards. Let's look at the score in the third end phase cards. And there are 3 of them, starting with Leading from the Back. Score this in an end phase if your leader is in your territory and not adjacent to an enemy, worth 1 glory point. I'm giving this a D because having any score in the third end phase card being worth only 1 glory point is a wasted card slot. Live to Fight Another Day. Score this in the third end phase if the only surviving friendly fighter is your leader, worth 2 glory points. I'm giving this a C because it's a bit better, but it's definitely hard to guarantee that you score this card because it puts the power in your opponent's hands in a sense, because you need to protect Scritch and ensure that all of your other units die. In order for your other units to die, your opponent has to actively kill them in most cases, meaning that this card is never going to be a sure thing in a third end phase. And our last card is Numberless Swarm. Score this in the third end phase if there are 5 friendly fighters on the battlefield. So if your whole warband is still alive in the third end phase, you get 1 glory point. I'm giving this a D, and that summarizes the objective cards. So let's look at what these things generally promote. They generally promote taking enemy fighters out of action, scoring surge objective cards, avoiding being taken out of action, being taken out of action, and keeping Spiteclaw alive. So that's the end of the objective cards. Now we're going to be looking at the power cards. So starting with deploys, we have Aversion to Death. So as a reaction, play this after an attack action that takes a friendly fighter out of action. Push up to 2 friendly fighters 1 hex each. I'm giving this an A because it's a nice reaction in response to one of your guys being taken out of action, which is a very likely thing to happen. Only real issue with this card is that you do not choose 2 friendly fighters, you just push them, which means it cannot inspire 2 friendly fighters, which is very disappointing. We have Frenzied Stabbing. The first attack action with a range of 1 or 2 in the next activation has +1 damage. So there's a generic +1 damage in the next activation card. I'm giving it a B. We have Heightened Caution. Roll an extra defense dice for the first friendly fighter to be targeted by an attack action in the next activation. So I'm giving this an A because it could bring these guys from 2 dodge to 3 dodge just once, which could be very important in saving a friendly unit, and especially useful if it's being used to save Scritch. We have Momentary Boldness. Choose a friendly fighter adjacent to 2 or more friendly fighters. That fighter makes a charge action. I'm giving this one an A as well because it does have that keyword choose in it, and it allows for an out of turn attack action. In fact, an out of turn charge, and these guys have 5 movement, which means a lot can be done with this card. Musk of Fear. Choose a friendly fighter and put them on guard. I'm giving this an A as well because guard is always useful, especially for warbands that have dodge defense. And you choose the fighter, which means that fighter also becomes inspired, making this card pretty nice. Next, there's Nervous Scrambling. Choose a friendly fighter. They switch places with any adjacent fighter. So basically a confusion card, but restricted to only members of your own warband, thus warranting a ranking of B. Scratching in the Shadows. Choose an enemy fighter and push them 1 hex. So a faction-specific distraction, worth an A ranking in my books. Skaven Courage. Play this if there are at least 3 friendly fighters adjacent to the same enemy fighter. One of those friendly fighters can make an attack action. So I'm giving this a B because it does provide a nice out-of-turn attack action. Unfortunately, it does not have the choose keyword, so that unit making the attack does not get inspired. And also, it does require that you have an enemy completely surrounded by 3 units, which can be pretty tough to pull off, especially if you draw this in a circumstance where you don't have a lot of fighters left on the battlefield. Sudden Skittering. Double the move characteristic of the first friendly fighter to make a move action in the next activation. They may not make a charge action. Once they have moved, they cannot be activated again in this phase. So you basically just double the move characteristic of 1 unit, but they cannot charge. I'm giving this a B because not being able to charge is kind of a bummer. There are always more. Choose a friendly fighter that is out of action, other than Scritch or Kirk. Remove all wound tokens from them and place them on any starting hex. I'm giving this an S because it's a free revival, which is amazing. It can even be played if Scritch had already been taken out of action. So that takes care of the ploys. So just to summarize, Gambit cards, deploy cards, typically promote pushing friendly and enemy fighters, increasing damage of attacks, improving defense, taking out of turn attacks, increasing movement, and summoning. So now let's take a look at the upgrade cards, starting with Black Hunger. Unique to Hungering Skaven, this fighter's attack actions with a range of 1 have +1 damage and target all adjacent fighters, friend and foe. You roll for each. Fighters do not provide support for attack actions against friendly models in attack or defense. I'm giving this an S because +1 damage and scything, and it can also be coupled with whatever weapon upgrades may have been put on Hungering Skaven, meaning that this thing can really steamroll through enemies, especially if it's mixed with those new combo upgrades that have been incorporated in Beastgrave. Bodyguard for a price. If Scritch is adjacent to this fighter, Scritch is on guard, even if Scritch has made a charge action in this phase and is restricted to Kirk. So I'm giving this a B because it's nice to have Scritch on guard, but it does require that Kirk always be adjacent to him. But it is nice in the sense that it does not put a guard token on him, but just allows him to be perpetually on guard, almost as if he had survival instincts. But Kirk can be taken out of action pretty easily, and then this ability goes to waste. Expendable. I've written the errata description on this card. So as a reaction, during an enemy fighter's attack action that targets this fighter, after the determine success step, if the attack action is successful, deal 1 damage to the attacker, then the attack action fails, the combat sequence ends, and the fighter is taken out of action. No player gains a glory point for this fighter being taken out of action, and it applies to all of the basic Skaven. I'm giving this an S because it's amazing. Allows a fighter to deal out a damage as it's being taken out of action, and prevents the enemy fighter from scoring any glory points or even being able to consider having taken the enemy out of action. which could also prevent the scoring of objective cards. So this card is very nice. And then you can just re-summon that dead Skaven and use Expendable over and over again. Festering Blades, unique to Festering Skaven. On a critical hit, this fighter's attack actions with a range of 1 or 2 have +2 damage. I'm giving this an S, which I typically don't do for cards that are restricted to any particular unit, but Festering Skaven can be re-summoned back after he's taken out of action, and if it's coupled with Haymaker or Potion of Strength, it could allow him to deal out some serious damage to enemies. Flee. As an action, this fighter and one adjacent friendly fighter can make a move action. Both fighters must end their move further away from all enemy fighters, and it's unique to Scritch. I'm giving this a C because it takes an action just to have your units move away from all enemy fighters, which might not even be possible in situations where you're surrounded, so it's just not very good. Kirk the Claw Chief. As an action, return a friendly fighter other than Scritch to the battlefield in an empty hex adjacent to this fighter, restricted to Kirk. I'm giving it a B because it's an okay replacement for Scritch's summoning ability in case Scritch got taken out of action, but it's not as good, and Kirk is kind of crappy, so this card is not that great. Skitter Scurry, unique to Scritch and Kirk. As a reaction, after any action that this fighter makes, you can push this fighter 1 hex. I'm giving it a B because it's nice if you make an attack, you can push your unit either further back or further towards other enemies. But as I mentioned before, you typically don't want to lead offense with Scritch, although it can be coupled with his summoning ability. And Kirk is okay, but you generally want to do most of your fighting with your general Skaven since they could be summoned back when taken out of action. So this card is okay, but it's not great. We have Sneaky Stab Stab. You can push this fighter 1 hex before they take an attack action, though not when this fighter takes a charge action. I'm giving it a B because it's nice in that you can get a little push allowing you to cover distance and hit enemies that you otherwise wouldn't be able to hit, but it can't be combined with charging, so I mean it's a decent card. Maybe it's worth an A. Swarm of Rats, unique to Kirk. An attack with range of 1 that hits with a die roll of 3 swords and does 1 damage, and it has Scything. An okay card, but the restriction to Kirk doesn't make it worth any more than a C ranking in my opinion. Throwing Stars, unique to Lurking Skaven, a range 3 attack that hits on 3 swords doing 1 damage. Pretty decent, I'm giving it a B. The only reason I don't give it a higher ranking is that there are universal upgrades that are typically better than this. And finally, we have Whirling Halberd for Scritch, a 1 range attack that does 2 damage and hits on 2 swords, also Scything. I'm giving it a C because the Scything is nice, but it does cut Scritch's range short, and it also has really low accuracy. And that covers all these guys' cards. So just to summarize the upgrade cards, they tend to promote increasing or causing damage, they improve defense, they prevent enemy glory points, they allow for more versatile summoning, they push friendly units, and they provide weapon upgrades that are not super useful, but not completely unuseful. And here is a big summary of all the rankings that I gave to all of these guys' cards. As you can see, the objective cards are typically pretty bad. There's only 3 cards that I ranked as B, which are decent, and most of their other cards are not very playable. Their Gambit cards, however, are fairly nice with their 1 S tier cards and their 5 A tier cards. Although it can be a bit tricky choosing Gambits for these guys in general because of that choose keyword that Spiteclaw's Swarm players ought to be looking for. And finally, upgrades. They have 3 awesome ones, 5 okay ones, and 3 not so useful ones. And that does it for my summary of all the cards of Spiteclaw's Swarm. Now it's time to rate this warband. So here's my overview. First of all, these guys have a great set of power cards, which enable them to have effective movement, control, and attack options. Secondly, their ploy-centered Inspire mechanic allows units to inspire easily, but it does force players to cater their power deck accordingly, which can force them to make some hard choices. Thirdly, this warband excels at a flex style. However, their objective cards favor risky aggression and survival, which is a mismatch for these guys, who therefore rely heavily on universal cards, therefore making their effectiveness in any given meta dependent on what universal cards are currently available. And finally, this warband also depends on Scritch's summoning ability, which means that Scritch's survival is very necessary, but fortunately Scritch is the greatest, so I guess it's not such a bad thing. So if we look at this warband as a whole, the rating that I've decided to give it is a B, landing somewhere in the middle tier. So I hope you all enjoyed my video. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, please comment below. Please like and subscribe if you like my videos. And in the description, I'll be including a balancing video where I provide recommendations as to what I suggest the Games Workshop should release in order to make this warband more competitive with some of the stronger warbands that exist today. So that does it for my video today, everybody, and I hope you all have a nice day.